Hello everybody and welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Roman legacy of bricklaying, or at least what we call the Roman Empire, and it's an interesting little study, so we're just going to jump right into it. What is this legacy that I'm talking about? There's something called opus spicatum, and I guess translates to spiked work, where small ceramic bricks the Romans laid in a herringbone pattern for pavement. And the remains of such work can still be found in many areas of the world even today. Now, a herringbone pattern is what you see on the right, and it's just a method of laying these bricks down almost in a zigzag pattern. And this herringbone pattern, it just, as mentioned, it dates back to the Roman Empire, where it was used in building its roadways. So it's just an interlocking paving system that was built on top of a base of crushed stone, which cleverly absorbed the compression of traffic and footfall, making it extremely stable and durable. And this is just an example of this particular type of paving in Trajan's market in Rome. So there's a lot of examples within Rome, but also in many other countries. But the interesting thing about this particular style of paving is once the Roman Empire goes into decline, this method is lost until the Renaissance. And this is just another example. I think this was from 2020, and not far down they found, just beneath the current street level, they found examples of this herringbone type of paving method that the Romans employed. So just really intriguing. And again, this is from Naples, but there's other examples, and this is the Piazza del Campo in Italy as well. And this public square, if you look closely, it's got all these zigzag patterns. Now, as I might have mentioned, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, many of the fundamental construction techniques of classical antiquity were lost and forgotten. So yeah, this particular design style, and it resurfaced again during the Renaissance, but there's this 1,000-year period where it's just sort of forgotten about. Now, they also find it, like I said, in a lot of other countries, including Egypt, and this was just a find in Alexandria, Egypt. Okay, so that's all interesting. Why are we talking about this? Before I get into that, I should mention that once you get to the Renaissance period, then you start getting this design being incorporated into flooring designs of palaces and places like that. So in the 17th and 18th centuries, herringbone floors were laid throughout castles and homes of the elite throughout Western Europe, including the Palace of Versailles. So where I'm going with this, there is an interesting structure called the Summer Palace of Peter the Great, basically, and it's in St. Petersburg, and the official construction date is given between 1710 and 1714. It's two-storied and not really that large, but when you go to the other side of this structure, which we're going to do in a second, things get really interesting. But we're told that the palace was built on the site of an already inhabited Swedish manor house. Okay, but when you get around to this side, it's almost got this sunken courtyard here, which in and of itself is no big deal. And as we start scrolling through some more images, here's just another vantage point. Okay, nothing too interesting about that. But when you start looking at depictions of the summer palace in the summer garden from the 1820s, there is no sunken courtyard back here. And when you start looking into the history of this place, in 1777, I think there was supposed to have been a great flood, and I guess there's been a lot of floods in St. Petersburg, but this seems to match what we see in a lot of different depictions. About 5 to 10 feet of sediment layer has accumulated. So I find that's just interesting in and of itself. But then another thing that stands out is there was an archaeological excavation done on this site, and we're just going to zoom in on this placard here. And wouldn't you know, it's got this interesting herringbone design with regards to the pavement in and around this sunken area here. But they're saying, according to the placard, paving with clinker in the 1700s was found during this archaeological research from 2009 to 2011. So it's this herringbone paving was used during the construction of the first embankment in the city. So I guess I'm questioning because a lot of this type of paving is heavily associated with the Roman Empire, what we call the Roman Empire. And it does make a reappearance during the Renaissance, but that's largely with interior design and in these palaces, not so much with paving. So I'm really wondering how old is this particular palace, at least maybe the foundation of it? Because when you start looking at, here's another view, of this herringbone pattern, and not the best image, but when you start zooming in here and you start looking in this particular area, you're gonna notice, I believe, some bricks. And here's just a side shot. So what I'm wondering is if this structure was built on top of maybe an much older foundation of another site. That's kind of what I'm wondering. And when you zoom in on this particular entrance, I believe this is supposed to be Minerva, and you have all these cannons, really interesting depictions. But if you look to the side here, and it definitely does appear to be these red bricks, these thinner, longer bricks. So I'm just wondering what we're actually looking at here. So I think that this might be mud flood affected, but it could be dating back much longer than we think, actually. And when you start looking at people who've looked into the history of this summer palace, they have some interesting things to say. I'll just read 3 of them. One person, this particular writer in 1839, said, "No correct information has survived about the construction of the summer palace." Another art critic at the beginning of the 20th century said, "The history of the summer palace has not yet been clarified." And an archaeologist, I'm not sure when he said this, but the early history of the Tsar's summer residence is steeped in legends. So I just think we might be looking at a much older foundation, what was maybe an older structure, in this pavement, and then they added this 2-story structure on top of they're using this as a foundation, is what I'm kind of speculating. It gets really confusing, but I think there's been 2 events where things got buried. We see a lot of Roman baths and villas and things like this be buried. And this is just one example. Below Exeter Cathedral, 5 to 10 feet, they find Roman remains of Roman baths in this case. And there's a lot of instances, things buried 5, 10, 20 feet that are Roman. But then we have a lot of interesting things that I think are after the Roman Empire, but they appear to be buried as well. And of course, we've got the buried blocks of Melbourne, and with all these artifacts. So I think there's been 2 events. And there's this interesting courthouse in the Union County Courthouse in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And they say the official narrative is this was constructed, I believe, in 1905. But if you go, here's an older photo of it. If you go around to the sides, on either side, there are these grates. And if you look down, you can see the 5 to 10 feet down, there's arches, and it's a red brick structure that's buried. So how old is this structure? I'm thinking it's from the more recent mud flood event, but I'm not sure. The outer shell is actually meant to deceive us. You got the raised steps, and it all sort of hides the fact that underneath this is just this buried red brick structure. But when was all this work done? Because I don't think it was done in 1905, and that's what makes this so interesting and confusing at the same time. I think we're looking at 2 separate events. That's where I'm at right now. And just another bit of intrigue going back to Italy and Florence. They found a small dome made of bricks laid in a herringbone pattern that's been unearthed near this cathedral in Florence, Italy. And here's what it looked like. And this particular structure was found a little over 2 feet below the surface level. And they're telling us that this structure was built in the early 1400s. And it was a construction workshop used by the people who helped build the Florence Cathedral and that large dome that sits on top of it. All right, interesting stuff. Why is this of interest to us? Well, because this mini dome here was built using this zigzag pattern, this herringbone pattern, and there was a building sitting on top of it. So there's I believe it's a museum. Yeah, I believe there's a museum that's really close to this cathedral, and I believe they annexed a building next to it to try and expand. And that building, I believe it used to be a theater that was built in 1790. Underneath that, they found this dome. So sitting underneath this structure, they found this buried dome that they tell us was from basically the early 1400s. Well, why is that interesting? Because less than 500 yards away from this cathedral is the Palazzo Vecchio, and I talked about this one of my more recent videos, but called Buried and Forgotten. Underneath this place, and by the way, 120 yards is the size of an American football field, so less than 4 football fields away from the cathedral is this Palazzo Vecchio. And I touched on this place in an earlier video, but underneath this place, they found the remains of a Roman theater, and it was forgotten about. So you have a Roman theater sitting underneath this Palazzo Vecchio, and less than 4 football fields away, you have this cathedral and this museum and this building, and underneath that building was this dome that was had this herringbone pattern, but they're telling us that was from the early 1400s, and you had this Roman theater, that dates to whatever, early AD. So like even though they're both buried underneath structures, they're both buried beneath these structures above ground. One is from Roman times and one is from the 1400s. See, I'm thinking they're probably from the same time period. And I just thought that was interesting, and I wanted to add that to the mix. So there's a lot going on. I think there's been 2 events which buried structures and layers of sediment and earth, and it's just really interesting stuff. So I think I'll leave it here for today, but once again, big shout out to all my patrons. Your help, as always, greatly appreciated, and I think I will leave it here for today. So until next time, take care. Bye.